Salams from the People's Dispatch studios in New Delhi. I'm Siddhant Ani. You're watching Daily Debrief. On the show today, elections in South Korea and India, and the US trying to re-engage with Venezuela. First up, the final results for the South Korean presidential elections that concluded are now out, and the conservative pro-US candidate has secured a victory. The margin has been razor thin. Yoon Suk-yeol of the People Power Party has been declared the winner, defeating the ruling Democratic Party's candidate Lee Jae-myung. The elections come at a time when tensions in the Korean Peninsula have been on the rise, with the peace process being stalled and repeated nuclear tests by the South and US provocations in the region. Joining us for more details on how the election unfolded and what it means for the region and the wider Pacific belt is Anish from People's Dispatch. Anish, tell us first how this transpired, a margin of victory in the end of less than a percentage point.
Yeah, it's actually the smallest margin that you can think of in Korea's history, South Korea's history at least. So this is 0.7%, and that translates to around 250,000 votes. But still, it was one of the closest, but also the most polarized, as we can see from the results right now.
Yeah.
And the reason primarily here is because the right actually consolidated behind Moon Suk-yeol. And primary reason is because there was a certain level of backlash against some of the failures of the incumbent government, especially in the domestic front. Rising inequality obviously was always an issue. It just became a bigger problem with rising unemployment and youth unemployment in the country. At the same time, you had anger over certain progressive movements that were coming up, which was like a very reactionary sort of anger, especially during the Me Too movement. And so the right wing sort of consolidated. They didn't really gain much. If you look at the combined vote shares of right-wing parties that contested against Moon Jae-in in 2017, the difference is something like 2%, 3%. It's not a major difference.
Right.
In fact, the Democratic Party actually really gained from 41 that they had in 2017. It has come to close to 48.7, yes,
right.
Close to that level.
Yeah.
So it was a sort of polarized election. So it is in that context that we are looking at this election results unfolding. And this is also going to become a bigger issue because more and more the politics of South Korea, which has been quite vibrantly multipolar in many ways. Obviously, there were different shades of conservatism and right-wing parties, but at the same time, there were also progressive movements and other forces that existed. Now, you don't have a virtual third party anymore. And that really shows that is going to be something that will happen in the next few years, because we need to remember the House, the National Assembly, is still democratic. So in that, they have about 180 seats of the 300-member House. So they still command a majority there. So there is definitely going to be confrontations between the president and the House. And until 2024, when the next election is scheduled. So they will definitely have to work in a very compromised position for both of them. It is, I think, the question for the rest of us, for people around the world, is the significance that I think it holds.
It has. No, and no doubt People's Dispatch will be covering in detail how the domestic impact of this election will play out over the next 3 or 4 years, or even immediately. But Yoon, who is now the president-elect of South Korea, a relative novice from a political standpoint, irrespective of what happens in the House, he'll have a major part to play in Korean diplomacy and foreign relations and foreign policy as it goes, which is critical, like you said, to the rest of us. Moon's legacy is advances in the peace process between the North and the South. What likely impact is this election to have on that?
So one of the things that he hasn't made any public pronouncements against the peace process as such, but he has raised supposed issues about the peace process of South Korea being relatively less armed compared to the North, and that a peace process or a peace negotiation has to be after South Korea has sufficiently armed itself.
Right. So some
And
kind
this,
of
yes,
military parity.
exactly. So this is basically a call for an arms race.
Yeah.
And this, obviously, this arms race is not coming without US support. The US definitely already has a huge presence, military presence in South Korea.
Yeah.
It has one of the largest Pacific commands in South Korea. And that has always been a point of contention, both in not only for North Korea but also for people living around these bases and in Korea itself, because we have had issues of even sovereign decisions being undermined in several instances,
Sure.
especially under right-wing governments.
Yeah.
So Moon is definitely going to, Yoon is definitely going to bring Korea back to that era of being a second fiddle to US policy, foreign policy in the region. And that is definitely not going to go very well with the North. And obviously, the peace process is currently, as you said, stalled. And it has to do largely with the way United States has refused to give any guarantees on taking away sanctions or any guarantees about even friendly trade relations between the two Koreas. So in that context, we are already looking at South Korea now ready to add, because even if Yoon has issues of completely pushing his policies in the domestic front, in the foreign policy front, he is going to have if not a free reign, it's kind of like exactly.
Especially if you consider the backing from the US.
Exactly, and he can really just bring up the number of military drills that South Korea does with the United States. That has always been the issue that North Korea has raised, because those drills always happen on the border and creates tensions, further tensions. So this is going to be a big issue. We have to keep watch, and it is a close watch. And this is especially important because as we have spoken about this multiple times in this show and other shows that of People's Dispatch, there is a very concerted encirclement policy, not only for against Korea. Obviously, North Korea definitely existed, but against China. So the US is definitely trying to create flashpoints in East Asia, and Taiwan was already being moved to that direction. It is likely that South Korea will also be turned into a possible flashpoint for future tensions, if not conflict.
Right. And we've seen, of course, with the war in Ukraine, how Russia also comes into the picture. So overall, not looking like a good scenario for any of us. Thanks very much, Anish, for the update. Right, results of state assembly elections of 5 Indian states are coming in today. That's March the 10th. The Narendra Modi-led Bharatiya Janata Party, or the BJP, is leading in 4 of the 5 states, while the fledgling Aam Aadmi Party has swept the state of Punjab. The other 4 states that are going to elections, of course, are the most populous state in India, Uttar Pradesh, the Himalayan state of Uttarakhand, the coastal state of Goa, and Manipur in the northeast of the country. Pragya from NewsClick is joining us today for more on these important, crucial, actually, assembly election results that are just coming in as we speak. Pragya, what's your first question, since the BJP is in power in the center as well, and UP is the most important state politically speaking in the country. What do you make of the 260 plus seats that the BJP is likely to win with its allies in that state?
Yeah, Siddhant, it's very unusual results. Even the last assembly election held in the state of Uttar Pradesh had led to a rather tremendous victory for the BJP, and the challengers had hoped to, make up a very large gap in the votes between them. But the Bharatiya Janata Party has increased its vote share slightly, and the rival formations have managed to catch up to the BJP, but they've fallen short by very wide margins. So this has actually got implications for national politics, in the sense that Uttar Pradesh, being the most populous state, also has the largest number of Lok Sabha, parliamentary seats.
Yeah.
So it means that the Bharatiya Janata Party, which has a nationalist flank, a Hindu nationalist flank, will go to the next national elections a little more confidently than before.
And with all this, both central government as well as the state government machinery backing them when those elections come around.
That's exactly the position that the state is in right now, and that will continue. So what people also expect is that there would be a more hardline stance from the Bharatiya Janata Party. They will interpret, how they interpret this election is still to be seen, but it is likely that they will see it as an endorsement of their entire politics.
Right.
So
Right. And largely, a lot of that election, particularly in UP, has been run, the campaign rather, has been run along those lines of whether it's
Absolutely.
the temple issue or
it was a
clear-cut
very divisive
Hindu-Muslim divide.
campaign. The minorities have a reason to be concerned about this kind of a verdict, especially because it is a verdict that comes after the BJP was already in power,
Right.
which means that the divide, the social divide, the religious divide, and now we also have a political divide to go with everything that was already happening.
Right. One of the reasons perhaps we're looking at the smaller states to kind of stand up for a more pluralistic form of governance or at least elected bodies in the states of, let's say, Punjab, Goa, Manipur, where minorities are in a much larger number,
Yes.
perhaps. But that has not really happened except for Punjab. Punjab stands out because like the Aam Aadmi Party, which also has the government in Delhi, has swept those elections.
Yes, in Punjab, which is a smaller state, the other four states are all relatively much smaller, but they are no less important because of what you just said. Now, Punjab was the epicenter of a farmer-led movement. So the symbol of the farmers was generally the tractor, which they use on their fields.
Right.
Now, the symbol of the Bharatiya Janata Party ruling at the center is actually the bulldozer, which they talk about. They will bulldoze their rivals with that. So while in Uttar Pradesh the bulldozer has beaten the tractor, in Punjab just the opposite has happened. The Bharatiya Janata Party does not have individual stakes, its own stakes in that state, but
Right.
the other opponents of the BJP at the central level, the Congress Party, would have hoped to do a little better than it has. The Aam Aadmi Party, which is a relatively very new party, it's just about a decade old. Its stakes in Punjab only exist in the sense that they had made a few inroads over there over the last election cycle, and then thereafter in some local elections. It is perhaps a verdict that will surprise them a little bit as well, but they have taken advantage. They have moved in at the right time when the people of Punjab were perhaps disenchanted with the options they had.
Everyone who has so far run the state. Fair enough. A very quick word from you, Pragya, on the Indian National Congress, which may be familiar to some of our wider viewers as the party that sort of led or played a critical role in India's movement for freedom, independence from British rule, gave its first prime minister in Nehru and led the country for many years, finding itself in a state of absolute disarray and shambles.
Yes, it is actually a big turning point. It is not the first turning point in the history of the Congress. But this seems to be, they have faced crisis before, there have been splits, there have been various problems. People have voted against it also. But this kind of a decline in which one election after election, they are in which, in repeated elections, they are unable to make their mark. So that is, this particular cycle of elections is going to create problems for them. In previous years, we have seen that the Congress Party has actually beaten the Bharatiya Janata Party, its chief rival, in assembly elections in the states. Often the Bharatiya Janata Party has tried to take back those states in its own control. So there is a bitter rivalry between these parties, and you do see the Congress try to fight back. But with the Aam Aadmi Party entering into Punjab, and then the BJP beating it in Uttar Pradesh, and also in Manipur, where they have not been able to make a mark. So they are going to enter the next cycle of elections for the country on the back foot.
Rock bottom definitely has been hit. Thanks so much, Pragya, for that. Moving on now to our final story. With sanctions imposed on Russian oil and gas exports by most of the Western world, the US is now seeking to re-engage with Venezuela, a country on which, of course, it's imposed crippling economic and political sanctions unilaterally that have pushed millions into poverty. And of course, it's a country that's facing a sustained US-led hybrid war. In 2019, the last elections in Venezuela, the US backed Juan Guaido over the legitimately elected popular government of Nicolas Maduro. How is this re-engagement going? Why is the US even having a conversation with Venezuela? For more on all of this, and what are the steps in return, of course, that Venezuela is taking to come back to sort of a table where they can at least have some dialogue. We spoke earlier to Zoe Alexandra of People's Dispatch.
So on Saturday, there was an article that came out in the New York Times saying that a high-level delegation of U.S. Officials of the Biden administration traveled to Caracas, Venezuela, to meet with President Nicolas Maduro. And I put emphasis on president because for the last 3 years, essentially, the White House, the United States government, has not recognized that Nicolas Maduro is president of Venezuela. And so I'll backtrack a little bit. Relations between the U.S. and Venezuela have been on very, very rocky terrain since January 2019. They broke off diplomatic relations. Following the inauguration of Nicolas Maduro, they essentially said that they recognized Juan Guaido, who unilaterally proclaimed himself president of Venezuela. They said that the elections that elected Maduro were fraudulent. And essentially in this moment in 2019, they ramped up a scale of what they had been already carrying out against Venezuela, which is comprehensive economic, financial, and sanctions against the country, specifically in this moment in 2019, targeting the oil producing sector. And so now, fast forward to March 2022, the world is really 2 weeks into this Ukraine-Russia conflict, which has global implications, specifically on the world supply of fuel, of gas, and of oil. Venezuela is one of the countries with the largest oil reserves in the world. And when the US shuts the country off from trade with not only the United States, but many other countries, they're also shutting off the supply of oil. So now, yesterday, President Joe Biden announced that they were blocking all importation of Russian oil. Where does that leave the United States with a huge energy crisis? They don't have enough natural reserves to subside their own demand. And so it's clear that they're looking to Venezuela to maybe ameliorate relationships, ease tensions, and potentially reactivate this very, very strong historic economic relationship that they've had with Venezuela. It was U.S. companies that have been in Venezuela exploiting that oil. Of course, when the Bolivarian Revolution happened, these oil companies were nationalized, and that already sparked the conflict. But now it looks like there's a possibility the U.S. wants to re-engage in trade with Venezuela on oil. One of the conditions is likely to be easing of the sanctions. This will be a welcome move for Venezuelans, for the entire country. So it's a very interesting moment. Yesterday, Maduro, the Venezuelan government released two prisoners that have U.S. passports. One was an executive from Citgo. Another was a Cuban American who was accused of terrorism. This also denotes that there's kind of an attempt to ease these relations, to make concessions. How far will it go? We have no idea, but it's clear that there has been a lot of behind the scenes discussions, a lot of talks happening to lead up to this moment.
Absolutely. Of course, in this context, these international ramifications also looks like it's having some kind of an impact on the domestic situation in Venezuela as well. We do know that talks had taken place, historic talks between the government and the opposition, which were progressing, and then for a variety of reasons, they were stopped. So could you tell this process might be resuming again? So could you take us through what's happening there as well?
Yeah, thanks so much for bringing it up. That's a crucial angle. So this, of course, does not only impact the economic relationship the U.S. has with Venezuela, but Venezuelan national politics. And so last year, in September 2021, Venezuela had begun a historic dialogue process in Mexico with a very broad sections of the opposition in Venezuela, including the section of the opposition that had supported Juan Guaido as interim president of Venezuela and had really supported this hardline push against the president, Nicolas Maduro. There were a couple rounds of talks that happened in Mexico. this process was one of the most promising. The Venezuelan government has attempted to engage in dialogue with various sections of the opposition over the past several years because of this protracted political and institutional conflict within the country. This, as I said, was one of the most successful rounds, attempts, really. They were able to get consensus on the fact that sanctions must be lifted against Venezuela. And at one point, the far right opposition was calling for sanctions. And so this was a huge, huge, huge victory. They also had consensus on the fact that Guayana Esquivia is the sovereignty of Venezuela. In addition to guaranteeing the political participation of all sectors of the opposition in electoral processes in Venezuela. And so we saw that last November, many opposition parties participated in this electoral process, which were recognized by the European Union and by other international bodies that in the past had not recognized this process. So I think this process, the dialogue process, was unfortunately suspended following the extradition of Alex Saab from Cape Verde to the United States, where he's currently in prison in Miami. And now President Maduro announced on Monday night that this dialogue process would be reinitiated. This is a really positive step forward, of course, for the people of Venezuela, beginning this dialogue process again. They're, of course, in a different moment economically. This is not Venezuela of 2017, where there's a massive economic crisis. Of course, the people are still suffering from sanctions, but the situation is doing better. I think with a positive step forward in these political negotiations, this could really mean a new period for Venezuela, one that is with less tensions, with less suffering, and more, building of harmony in the country.
Thank you so much, Zoe, for that report. We'll get back to you soon on these issues as well.
That's all we have on this episode of Daily Debrief. For more details on all of these stories, head over to our website, peoplesdispatch.org, and do give us a follow on all the regular social media platforms for updates. We'll be back again tomorrow, same time, same place. Until then, stay safe. Goodbye.